The European Union has been a symbol of unity and cooperation for decades, but today it is facing an unprecedented crisis. From mounting economic challenges to growing political divisions, the EU faces an existential threat. We'll also explore the possible consequences of the collapse of the EU and what it could mean for the future of Europe. So join us as we delve into why the European Union is on the brink of collapse. The situation of the European Union is becoming increasingly dire as the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022 continue to be felt. The invasion initially took the EU by surprise and sparked a sense of shock and solidarity among its members. In response, the EU quickly imposed sanctions on Russia and called for an immediate ceasefire. However, 8 months later, the EU is facing a perfect storm of economic challenges as a result of the invasion. The most pressing of these challenges are the record levels of inflation that the EU is currently experiencing. Inflation in October reached a record high in the 19 Eurozone countries, with Germany at 11.6%, Italy at 12.8%, and France at 7.1%. The increase in energy prices, 41.9%, and food, alcohol and tobacco, 13.1%, were the main contributors to this increase. Another major concern for the EU is the expected energy crisis looming as winter continues. The EU is highly dependent on Russia for its energy needs, and the sanctions imposed on Russia have made it more difficult for EU members to import energy from them. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has warned several times that countries in Central and Eastern Europe could experience shortages, rationing, and gross domestic product losses of up to 3%, as well as further increase in inflation across the continent if Russia is to cut off their gas to Europe completely. In addition to economic challenges, the EU is also facing protests and strikes related to the rising cost of living. These protests are happening across the EU, demanding higher wages and more government help in the face of economic hardship. Some of the protests also targeted Russian sanctions and the government's apparent lack of action to address the economic crisis. In response to inflation, the European Central Bank, ECB, has raised interest rates, putting pressure on companies and high-debt EU members, such as Italy, by increasing borrowing costs. This means that it becomes more expensive for these countries to borrow money, which may further exacerbate economic challenges. Despite these challenges, the EU experienced 0.2% growth in gross domestic product in the third quarter of 2022. But economists predict a recession is imminent. In addition, the IMF also warned that the EU could face a prolonged period of low growth, high unemployment, and large debt overhangs if it fails to address current economic challenges. The IMF also urged EU leaders to take bold and decisive action to address the economic crisis, including implementing structural reforms, increasing public investment, and providing support to affected businesses and households. The EU also faces challenges when it comes to sanctions against Russia. Several EU governments have begun to express doubts about future sanctions, and growing internal discontent threatens the durability of current sanctions. Hungary, in particular, has consistently been the most difficult EU member to bring into sanctions. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who is considered a Russian sympathizer, has intensified his attacks on EU sanctions. He successfully pushed for a waiver of the EU embargo on Russian oil in June and is now demanding the same for a possible EU price cap on imported Russian gas. Orbán has also been blocking the latest EU economic support package for Ukraine, which requires unanimous approval. This marks Hungary's biggest break with the EU since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and has drawn strong criticism from other members. Orbán has claimed that EU sanctions are devastating Hungary's economy, and even more disturbingly, he made a veiled prediction of the disintegration of the EU, comparing it to the collapse of the Soviet bloc. The EU is at a critical moment. The economic challenges it faces are significant, and there is growing concern that member countries could take unilateral measures in response to the economic crisis, which could break the unity of the EU. The EU must act swiftly and decisively to address these challenges and find a way to maintain its unity, or risk facing a similar fate to the Soviet bloc. As the economic situation in the EU continues to deteriorate, the pressure is mounting on governments to find solutions. Protests and strikes are becoming more frequent and widespread, with demands for higher wages, but also for more government help in the face of economic difficulties. Some protests have also focused on Russian sanctions and the government's apparent lack of action to address the economic crisis. The EU is also facing a growing divide between its northern and southern members. Northern countries led by Germany have traditionally been more fiscally conservative and have advocated austerity measures to deal with economic challenges. The southern countries, on the other hand, have shown themselves to be more open to more expansive policies and have criticised the austerity measures imposed on them during the last financial crisis. This division is becoming more pronounced as the current economic crisis deepens and threatens to further strain relations between EU members. EU leaders, including France's President Macron and Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, have called for a greater fiscal integration and a more lenient approach to economic recovery in the face of the ongoing economic crisis. President Macron has been a strong advocate of deeper fiscal integration within the EU, arguing that the economic challenges facing the Union need to be addressed. He's called for the creation of a European Finance Ministry, which would be responsible for overseeing the EU budget and managing its debt. He's also proposed the creation of a European unemployment insurance scheme, which would provide financial assistance to workers who lose their jobs. Chancellor Scholz, on the other hand, has focused on the need for a more lenient approach to economic recovery. He's called for a relaxation of EU fiscal rules, which would allow more public spending to stimulate economic growth. He has also proposed the creation of a European Recovery Fund, which would provide financial assistance to countries hardest hit by the economic crisis. Both Macron and Scholz have recognised that the EU faces significant economic challenges and that a more integrated and coordinated response is needed to address them. However, his proposals have met with resistance from other EU member states, particularly northern countries, which have traditionally been more fiscally conservative and have advocated austerity measures to address economic challenges. While there are many speculations about the EU's existential crisis, a new book published by Ian Kearns describes how and why the EU might collapse. Kearns' book, Collapse: Europe After the European Union, describes in shocking and all too real detail the specific scenarios that could lead to the European Union's demise. What is even more concerning, 2 of the 6 scenarios, a populist breakthrough in Italy and a resurgence of the migration crisis, have arguably begun since the book's April publication. Collapse depicts the disastrous economic, political, and geopolitical developments that are likely to happen if these or other scenarios occur. However, the book is a warning about a possible future, not a prediction of what will happen. It also makes recommendations on how to avoid the worst-case scenarios and position Europe for a success in the remaining years. The next few months will be crucial in determining whether the EU will be able to achieve the necessary level of integration and coordination to face the current economic crisis and emerge stronger. We hope you now have a better understanding of the factors contributing to the current crisis in the EU, including economic challenges, political divisions, and the impact of external events. Do you think the EU will make it through this crisis and emerge stronger? What do you think are the worst consequences of the EU collapsing? Let us know in the comment section below. We hope you liked this video. Let us know which topics we should explore next. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content on current events and global issues. Thanks for watching.